Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're diving into a world where truth, let's just say it's slippery, the world of psychological operations.
It's a world where governments and powerful entities, well, they try to influence what we believe and how we act.
Exactly. We'll be uncovering the tactics they use, how those tactics have evolved, and, how they're deployed in the digital age.
Yeah, it's a wild ride through history and current events.
Absolutely. And to guide us on this journey, we've got a stack of videos and articles.
We do. And let me tell you, some of this stuff is seriously intense.
It is. But remember, we're here to present the info from these sources objectively. We're not taking sides. We want you to listen, think critically, and draw your own conclusions.
Right. We're going to connect the dots, unpack the complexities, and hopefully spark some serious critical thinking.
So to kick things off, let's talk about coups. You know those forceful takeovers of governments? The ones that always make headlines.
Right. And the thing is, what's often overlooked is the role of powerful nations in these coups, like the United States.
Yeah. The U.S. has a long history of intervening in foreign governments, sometimes openly, sometimes covertly.
Definitely.
One of our sources, a video by Johnny Harris, actually maps out all these American-backed coups throughout history. It's pretty amazing to see just how many interventions there have been.
It is, and it really highlights the geopolitical landscape of the past century, especially during the Cold War when the U.S. saw itself as, the protector against communism.
Right. And the video points out that some of these interventions were tied to economic interests.
Exactly.
Like the 1953 coup in Iran, after the prime minister nationalized the oil industry.
And it's fascinating because the resentment from that coup, it still echoes in Iran today. It's
Yeah.
a key factor in their distrust of Western powers.
Really makes you think. So it wasn't always about ideology. Sometimes it was about protecting economic interests, access to resources.
Absolutely. And the methods they used, they varied so much.
Oh, yeah.
Sometimes the U.S. would just piggyback off existing independence movements, like in Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines.
Essentially using those movements to install leaders who were more, I guess you could say, friendly to American interests.
Yeah, exactly. Other times it involved direct military intervention, like the invasion of Grenada in 1983, or the more recent interventions in Iraq and Libya.
Okay, so now let's shift gears a bit. Let's talk about something that sounds like it's straight out of conspiracy theory. Operation Mockingbird.
Oh, yeah.
One of our sources, a video called Proven Conspiracies, alleges that this was an actual CIA program. And get this, they designed it to manipulate the media.
Yeah, and it's important to understand the historical context here. This was the Cold War. I mean, there was a genuine fear of communist infiltration and propaganda within the United States.
Right, so the source claims that the CIA used journalists to spread their own propaganda, essentially controlling the narrative around certain events or ideologies.
And it wasn't just a few rogue journalists. The source alleges that prominent figures like Gloria Steinem and organizations like the National Student Association were involved.
Wow. Now, some people might dismiss this as, just a conspiracy theory. But the source presents some pretty compelling evidence, like declassified documents, testimonies from former CIA officials.
It does, and it raises some unsettling questions about the role of the media. The potential for manipulation, even from sources we think are trustworthy.
Exactly. Ever wonder why certain narratives gain traction so quickly online? Like, is it organic? Or could there be unseen forces shaping the conversation, just like in the days of Operation Mockingbird?
It's a question we're thinking about, especially in today's world. Social media, instant information.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so before we move on to another piece of this puzzle, let's take a quick pause. What are your initial thoughts on all this?
It's a lot to take in, right? I mean, are you starting to see the complexities, that blurred line between truth and manipulation? And this is just the beginning. Things get even more intricate.
Oh yeah, buckle up, because we're about to enter the world of high finance. Alleged money laundering. Ever heard the Five-Star Trust?
This is where things get really interesting and complicated. The Five-Star Trust, according to one of our sources, was this elaborate financial scheme. They allegedly used it to launder billions of dollars.
Billions. The source, a video by Ian Carroll, paints this picture of a massive web of transactions, shell companies, international banks, all designed to move and conceal these vast sums of money.
And the alleged purpose.
Yeah.
To fund covert CIA operations, including those coups we talked about earlier.
So this scheme potentially connects directly back to those interventions.
Potentially, yeah. And if that's not enough, the source also implicates some pretty powerful figures in this scheme, like former CIA Director Richard Helms, even George H.W. Bush.
Wow, this is getting heavy. But wait, there's more. The source also alleges that the five-star trust was connected to drug trafficking, specifically the sale of heroin to U.S. service personnel during the Vietnam War.
Now, it's really important to note these are very serious allegations, and
Yeah.
fully verifying them is, well, it's extremely difficult because of the secretive nature of these operations.
Right. But the source does present a pretty compelling case. They give details about specific transactions, dates, individuals involved. It's certainly enough to raise some eyebrows.
Absolutely. The five-star trust, if these allegations hold water, reveals a potentially very dark side of covert operations, one where illicit activities may have been used to finance interventions and influence global events.
So we've got coups, media manipulation, and now this complex financial web potentially connecting them all. What does it all mean? Are we just pawns in some elaborate game?
That's a question we're going to keep exploring as we dive deeper into the world of PSYOPs. But for now, let's just let this information sink in.
Welcome back. In part one, we uncovered some pretty unsettling truths about coups and media manipulation and shadowy financial schemes. Ready to go even deeper.
Absolutely, let's do it. We're about to unpack how the tactics of psychological operations have evolved over time, becoming even more subtle and pervasive.
All right, so let's start with a question for you. What comes to mind when you hear the term propaganda? Do you picture those old school posters with, bold slogans and exaggerated imagery?
Yeah, that's certainly one form of propaganda, but it's definitely not the only one. Propaganda can be much more subtle, weaving itself into, seemingly harmless entertainment, or even everyday conversations.
One of our sources argues that propaganda is all about controlling the narrative, shaping the way people perceive events and ideologies.
And the methods they use have become increasingly sophisticated, especially with the rise of mass media and, more recently, the internet and social media.
Right, and we already touched on Operation Mockingbird, that alleged CIA program to influence the media during the Cold War. One of the sources claims that the CIA went beyond just planting stories, that they actively tried to discredit opposing viewpoints.
Think about it this way. Propaganda isn't always about outright lies. It can be about, selectively highlighting certain information, framing stories in a particular way, or even using humor and satire to shape public perception.
So it's about controlling the information flow, influencing what people see and hear, and ultimately how they think.
Exactly. And this control can be incredibly powerful, especially when the public is unaware that they're being influenced.
Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about a different kind of psyop, one that's designed to create fear and panic rather than subtly shape opinion. Have you ever heard of a false flag operation?
A false flag operation is a covert operation designed to deceive the public, making it appear as if an act of terrorism or aggression was committed by a different group or nation than the one actually responsible.
One of our sources points to an alleged incident involving the CIA in Guatemala in 1954. They were trying to overthrow the government. And to do that, they staged an attack on their own clandestine radio station.
Oh, wow.
To make it seem like they were under attack.
The goal was to create a pretext for intervention, to convince the public both domestically and internationally that their actions were justified.
And these tactics can be very effective because they play on people's existing fears and anxieties. They create this sense of urgency and make it easier to rally support for drastic measures.
Absolutely. False flag operations highlight the potential for deception and manipulation on a grand scale. It's a stark reminder that governments have the capacity to deceive their own citizens, and that this deception can have really far-reaching consequences.
Now let's bring this into the modern era. How have PSYOPs evolved with the rise of the internet and social media? I mean, we're bombarded with information from all sides these days. How can we even tell what's real anymore?
It's a really good question, and a big challenge. The digital age has created this unprecedented level of information saturation, but it's also made us more vulnerable to manipulation.
One of our sources describes it as informational total warfare. It paints a pretty bleak picture, doesn't it?
It does. We're constantly bombarded with messages, often tailored to our specific interests and beliefs, thanks to the algorithms that power our social media feeds and search results.
So in a way, the battlefield has shifted from traditional media outlets to our own personalized online bubbles.
Exactly. And that makes it even harder to discern truth from falsehood, to separate genuine news from carefully crafted propaganda.
So how do we navigate this increasingly complex landscape? How do we protect ourselves from being manipulated? What can we do?
That's the million-dollar question. And unfortunately, there's no easy answer. But one of our sources emphasizes the importance of developing critical thinking skills.
Okay, so what does that look like in practice? Give us some tips.
Well, it starts with being aware of our own biases. We all have them, and they can influence how we interpret information. We need to actively seek out diverse perspectives, even those that challenge our own beliefs.
That's easier said than done, especially when we're constantly being fed information that confirms our existing biases.
Well, you're absolutely right. It takes effort to break out of our echo chambers and engage with different viewpoints, but it's crucial if we want to develop a more nuanced understanding of the world.
So we need to be more critical of the information we consume, even if it comes from sources we generally trust.
Exactly. Don't just accept things at face value. Ask questions. Look for evidence.
Yeah.
And be wary of anyone who claims to have all the answers.
Another source we have for this deep dive points out the importance of recognizing emotional manipulation. Propaganda often plays on our fears, our desires, and our tribal instincts.
Right. Think about the language being used. Are there attempts to create an us versus them mentality? Are facts being replaced by appeals to emotion? These are all red flags that should make you pause and think critically about the information you're consuming.
Okay, that's helpful. So we need to be mindful of our own biases, seek out diverse perspectives, and be wary of emotional manipulation. What else can we do to protect ourselves from being manipulated?
Another important tip is to pay attention to the source of the information. Who's behind the website, the article, the video? What's their agenda? Are they trying to sell you something, promote a particular ideology, or simply gain your attention?
That's a great point. It's easy to get caught up in a catchy headline or a compelling story without stopping to consider who's behind it.
And don't forget to fact check. If something sounds too good to be true or too outrageous to be believable, it probably is. There are tons of reputable fact-checking websites available online.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the evolution of psyops, the challenges of navigating the digital age, and some practical tips for developing critical thinking skills. What are your final thoughts for our listeners before we wrap up part 2?
I'd say this. Be aware that psychological operations are all around us. They're not just something that happened in the past or something that only affects other people. We're all potential targets. But by understanding how these tactics work, we can become more discerning consumers of information and less susceptible to manipulation.
That's a powerful message. So in part 3, we'll delve into some specific examples of psyops in the digital age and explore how these tactics are being used to shape our perceptions of current events. Yeah. It's going to be eye-opening, so make sure you join us for the final part of this deep dive. Welcome back. So in parts 1 and 2, we explore this world of psychological operations, from historical examples like coups and propaganda to how these tactics have evolved in our digital age.
Right.
And now in this final part, we're going to shine a light on how psyops are playing out in the information landscape we navigate every single day.
Yeah, we're going to examine real-world examples of how these tactics are being used to shape public perception, influence decision-making, and even sow discord among the population.
Yeah, because let's face it, in today's world, we are bombarded with information from all sides. It's coming at us through our social media feeds, news websites, podcasts, videos, you name it.
Absolutely. And it's not always easy to figure out, what's fact and what's fiction. Genuine news from carefully crafted narratives designed to push certain agendas.
Right. One of the sources we have highlights this concept of echo chambers, those online spaces, where people tend to gravitate towards information that confirms their existing beliefs.
Yeah.
Think about your own social media feeds for a second. Do you mostly see information that aligns with your worldview?
It's easy to get stuck in those echo chambers.
It is.
Yeah.
Echo chambers can be comforting. They provide a sense of belonging and validation,
Right.
but they can also make us more susceptible to manipulation because we're less likely to encounter, challenging viewpoints.
Right.
Or information that contradicts our beliefs.
Mm.
So how do we break out of these echo chambers and become more discerning consumers of information?
Well, one of the sources suggests that we need to be more proactive in seeking out diverse perspectives.
Okay, so what does that look like in practice?
Well, you got to make a conscious effort to read articles and watch videos from sources that you might not typically agree with. Challenge yourself to understand different viewpoints, even if they make you a little uncomfortable.
It's about expanding our horizons, right? Getting outside of our own bubble and recognizing that there are multiple ways of interpreting events and issues.
Exactly. It's also about being critical of all sources of information, even those that we generally trust.
One of the sources we have points out that even mainstream media outlets can be influenced by government agendas, corporate interests, or even just the biases of individual journalists.
Right.
So even if you're getting your news from what you consider a reputable source, it's important to, apply those critical thinking skills.
For sure.
Okay, so let's talk about some specific red flags that should make us question the information we're consuming. One source highlights the use of emotional manipulation as a key tactic in psychological operations.
Yeah, and remember, propaganda often plays on our fears, our hopes, our tribal instincts. So if you're reading an article or watching a video that's trying to evoke a strong emotional response, whether it's anger, fear, or even excessive optimism, that's a cue to pause and examine the content more closely.
So if something's making you feel outraged or overly enthusiastic, take a step back and ask yourself why. Who's creating this content? What's their agenda? And are they using emotional manipulation to try to sway your opinion?
Exactly.
Those are great questions. Another red flag is the use of overly simplistic narratives, often framed as us versus them.
Oh, yeah. This kind of black and white thinking is a classic propaganda technique. It's designed to divide people, create an enemy, and make it harder to see the complexities of a situation.
Right, so if you encounter information that's trying to paint a whole group of people as evil or dangerous, be skeptical. Look for evidence that challenges these simple narratives.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's bring this all together with a real-world example. Remember that Tesla Cybertruck explosion in Las Vegas?
Oh, yeah.
We talked about it in part 2.
Right.
Well, this incident and the media coverage surrounding it provides a perfect case study in how psyops can play out in the digital age.
Yeah. And remember, we're not trying to draw any definitive conclusions about this particular incident. It's just a great opportunity to apply the critical thinking skills we've been talking about.
Right. One of the sources raises the possibility that there was a deliberate attempt to control the narratives surrounding this explosion. Think about how the story unfolded. There was a lot of speculation about the suspect's motives, his mental state, his alleged ties to extremist groups.
Right.
But how much of this information was based on solid evidence and how much was speculation or even disinformation?
Yeah, good question.
Did the media rush to judgment? Were certain narratives amplified while others were suppressed?
All good points.
These are all important questions to consider. It's a great reminder that we need to be particularly cautious about the information we accept, especially in the immediate aftermath of a major event. When emotions are running high and the full picture is often unclear.
Absolutely. Those are the moments when we're most vulnerable to manipulation. So what can we do to protect ourselves? Well, one of the sources recommends looking for patterns, inconsistencies, and alternative explanations.
Okay.
Don't just accept the dominant narrative at face value. Seek out information from a variety of sources, consider different perspectives, and be wary of anyone who claims to have all the answers.
It's about staying curious, staying skeptical, and never stopping asking questions.
Exactly.
And ultimately, it's about recognizing that we all have a responsibility to be discerning consumers of information. In a world where psychological operations are becoming increasingly sophisticated and pervasive, critical thinking is our most powerful weapon.
Very well said. By understanding the tactics used to influence our thoughts and beliefs, we can become more resilient to manipulation and make more informed decisions.
And that wraps up this deep dive into the world of psychological operations. We hope this exploration has, empowered you to navigate this complex information landscape with a more critical eye.
Absolutely.
Remember, knowledge is power, but only when we understand how to wield it responsibly.
Thanks for listening.